Hello, welcome to Beaver Lake's Arboretum. Today, I thought we'd go on a tour of the Arboretum. Now there's 80 species of trees and shrubs in the Arboretum, so it was kind of difficult to decide which ones to talk about today. So I narrowed it down to talk about some of our native deciduous trees. Now obviously a native tree is a tree that grows in either North America, some are native to Beaver Lake in central New York, so I picked a few of those species. Deciduous simply means that the trees lose their leaves, unlike the conifers that retain their needles all winter long. So they're called evergreens. So today we'll begin by going to one of our first trees, the yellow birch. It's right over here. So the first tree I'd like to show everyone is the yellow birch. People are familiar with birch trees, paper birch, which is over here, yellow birch by its bark, peely, shredding bark. And in this case, it's called yellow birch and sometimes golden birch by the hue and color of the golden yellow bark. Yellow birch is an important tree, and especially in eastern Canada where it's a lumber tree. It's one of the highly favored source of wood and lumber in eastern Canada. It's important in the Northeast because it's one of the trees that can grow in its own shade. It's very shade tolerant. We'll show you others like the sugar maple, which also grow in conjunction with this tree, as well as the hemlock. They can grow in their own shade. So they become what's called a climax tree in a forest. Yellow birch also are an important food source for various animals. They produce a catkin fruit, which is eaten by squirrels and other rough grouse love them because they fall on the ground. Also, this tree is tapped for its syrup, just like the sugar maple. It takes a lot more sap to produce a bottle of birch syrup as opposed to maple syrup, but it is nevertheless tapped for its sap. Another interesting point is the Native Americans use this tree for a lot of different things. You've heard of birch bark canoes. They use the birch bark of the yellow birch, white birch, paper birch, peeled it back because it's very strong, pliable, and would be waterproof, so they would create birch bark canoes. They also discovered that the leaves and the twigs contained salicylic acid, an ingredient in aspirin, so it was a natural blood thinner as well as a mild pain reliever. If you scratched a twig on a yellow birch tree, in fact you'll smell a wintergreen odor. That's another identifying feature of the yellow birch. Almost all birch leaves are similar in this oval shape with a teethed edge to them. So this is the yellow birch, our first tree in this series of native deciduous trees. All right, we're looking at one of the most famous trees. In fact, this is the New York State tree. And you might recognize the shape of this leaf. It's found on the flag of Canada, our northern neighbor. Everyone knows this as the sugar maple. Sugar maples are real important trees for a lot of reasons. Ecologically, they're become a dominant tree in the forest. They can grow in their own shade. Economically, they're used as one of the strongest hardwoods. They're used from everything from basketball courts to pool cues. And of course, everyone knows the most famous reason we love this tree is because of its sweet, sweet sap. The Native Americans called this tree the Sweetwater tree. It had the richest syrup tasting sweet sap of any tree. So you could boil it down and create this wonderful substance we know as maple syrup. This in fact was boiled down here at Beaver Lake this March. So it's fresh syrup. That's why there's no label on it yet. We're still producing those. So maple syrup industry in New York State is really a strong industry, as in most of the Northeast. The tree occurs primarily in the Northeast. It does go south a bit, but needs proper conditions found in the Northeast to produce that sweet sap and have it flow in a way that we can extract it by tapping the trees to get enough to boil down to syrup. If you've been to our maple sugar tours, you know that it takes 40 gallons of this sweet sap to boil down to just 1 gallon of syrup. It grows with other trees like the yellow birch and hemlock. And in fact, I just found this out doing little research for this, is that it creates areas around the base of the tree through what's called allelopathy. In other words, it exudes toxins that will inhibit the growth of other trees, especially its competitors, yellow birch. So this tree has a lot of uses. It's one of the most important trees, and it's a beautiful tree to use as a shade tree as well. Here we have black walnut. Now, walnut trees, like other forest trees, like we might have seen, the maple, sugar maple, produce a lot of things that we can use as humans. And squirrels. Walnuts, obviously the first thing you think of are the nuts. This is I found this on the ground. It's a prematurely dropped fruit. It's called a drupe, as a matter of fact. Drupes are fruits like peaches, prunes, and plums. They're stone fruit. So the outside fleshy part comes off. Well, this is how we see them later in the season. They darken up and they peel off, and inside is the stone, the center part. To get to the actual meat of the nut, you know, you've got to split it in half, or in the squirrel's case, chew on it to get inside to that tasty meat. So walnut trees are important for the nuts and the wood. The wood is very valuable. It's a dark, dark wood. What I'm doing here is trying to show you that if I rub my fingers, you can't really see it, but it kind of produces a dark color. The Native Americans found early on that if they boiled down this outer husk when it got darker, they could create a dye. So this dye also has chemicals in it that help set the dye up. So it was used as to dye fabric, maybe to use on pottery. So this tree is a multi-use tree. Again, really good for wildlife. This leaf is unlike the trees, some other trees like the birch or the sugar maple. Those are called simple leaves. What I'm holding here is called the petiole. This is the point of attachment to the branch. So the petiole of a simple leaf just goes into the leaf itself. So the whole leaf is attached to that petiole. In this case, you've got the petiole and these leaflets. So this is one whole leaf, and these are leaflets. You might have heard the phrase, leaves of three, leave it be for poison ivy. Well, it's kind of right, but it's not 100% correct. The leaves on a poison ivy leaf are actually leaflets. That's a compound leaf too. So this is a very large compound leaf of the black walnut. Black walnuts grow around this region especially because they think Native Americans would take the nuts with them and plant them in their settlements. So especially the Onondaga Nation who lived in this area, there's pockets of populations of black walnuts. And it's because the tree was very important for the dye, which we talked about, and the nut itself. It also does something called allelopathy. Through the roots underground and the decomposing leaves, it spreads a toxin which keeps other plants from growing. So it's in some situations, in urban situations in your yard, it might kill the grass, but tomato plants especially are affected by this toxin called juglone, which is part of its scientific name. So Juglans nigra is the black walnut, and this is a beautiful specimen growing in our Arboretum. All right, this is a fascinating tree. We have a specimen in the Arboretum. I love this tree because it's just so unique. It's a Kentucky coffee tree. Why is it called a coffee tree? Well, it's a legume. It produces large pods, which we don't have because they fell in the fall. The pods contain coffee-like beans. Now the beans are toxic, as is the pod, until they're roasted. So they would take the beans, roast them, and it would be used as a coffee substitute. So that's why it's called the coffee tree. It's actually very rare in the wild. There's scattered populations in the Midwest and the Upper South, but it's planted very commonly as a unique ornamental, and it's a street tree. Now, one of the most fascinating things about it, besides that, the pods and the coffee-like beans, are the leaves. The leaves are huge, and They're a doubly compound leaf called pinnately compound, like a feather. So we have the petiole. The petiole is the attachment point to the stem. Simple leaves like birches and beech have the petiole and the leaf itself. This is the stem of the leaf called the petiole, and from this, the Kentucky coffee tree leaf, we've got leaflets that are also compound. So it's doubly compound, and in this case, doubly pinnately compound, because they look kind of like pin feathers of a bird. So this is the main stem of the leaf, and each one of these with these leaflets are a leaflet. So it's an amazing tree. Beautiful bark, dark furrowed bark, and the pods in the fall are harvested in some cases still to this day, where they roast the beans and give a tasty coffee-like substitute. But don't ever eat them raw because they're toxic. I might not have mentioned that. Right, we're at the base of a northern Catalpa tree. This tree is a beautiful ornamental. It's a medium-sized tree. It might get to be 80 to 90 feet. And it's planted in urban areas commonly because of its beautiful flowers. It's flowering right now as we speak. It's got clusters of these beautiful white flowers. It flowers just after black locust, which also has a white flower. Later on in the summer, you're going to see the white flowers of horse chestnut. I've always thought in my yard, if someday I could plant trees like these that flower throughout the summer. These are visited by pollinators. Hummingbirds like these flowers as well, and up there around you can hear a lot of bees and flies coming to this fragrant flower. I just smelled it, and it smells of a vanilla flavor smell and almost like an orchid odor. So it's a beautiful tree to plant in your yard. It does have some drawbacks. For one, the flowers all fall off and they spread around your yard. In the fall, it creates this long pea-like pod. It's not a legume like other trees here, like the black locust and the Kentucky coffee tree, but it produces this pea-like pod that sheds all over the lawn. So people find it might be a little bit problematic to clean up that mess every year, but it's a beautiful tree. It's got these large heart-shaped leaves. We do summer camp here at Beaver Lake, and this is one of the favorite leaves for the children to collect and paint on the back and press it on their t-shirt because of this beautiful shape. The northern Catalpa tree. Its wood is used for various things like wood carving and cutting boards because it has the lowest shrinkage of any wood. So when it's cut, it doesn't decrease in size. The only tree that's close to it in its shrinkability, if you want to call it that, or the lack of shrinkability, is the northern white cedar. So it's also used in boat construction because it retains its shape and size. So this is the northern Catalpa tree. I'd like to grow one in my yard someday. All right, liquid ambar styrosiflua, the sweet gum. One of the first things you notice about this tree is its 5-pointed star-shaped leaves. It sounds like the name styrosiflua refers to the star-shaped leaf, but it actually refers to the resinous aromatic sap that comes out and thickens into a gum. It was used in the old days as a chewing gum, an additive to chewing gum to give it its flavor and its chewability, if you want to put it that way. It's a beautiful tree. It grows more in the southeast, but it's planted up here as an ornamental. There's several planted at Beaver Lake, apart from the one here in our Arboretum. So look for this tree, but watch out when you're walking, especially in the fall. I mean, we do wear shoes here, but these spiny seed balls inside are the seeds, and it creates this seed cluster, and they're very spiny. They're not as sharp as something like the American chestnut or horse chestnut, but they're kind of formidable. They're also kind of nice. We do classes in the winter of natural ornaments, and I know one year we took these, spray painted them silver, and you can see they would kind of make a neat natural ornament for Christmas time. So the sweet gum tree has a lot of different usage. The wood itself is used as a veneer because it's very tight grained, and like I said, the gum itself was used in chewing gum, and it had some medicinal properties that the Native Americans took advantage of as well. So if you're walking in the Arboretum and come upon this tree, beautiful straight trunked tree, and read the sign, it says yellow poplar. It's a little deceiving because this is not a true poplar. The reason it's called poplar, yellow poplar, is because of the wood. The wood is very similar to a poplar tree, like a cottonwood or quaking aspen. It's yellowish in color, the wood, and it's not as strong as a hardwood like a maple or a beech. But the properties of the wood are very interesting because it's very tight grained. It doesn't split, so it's used for things like cutting boards, veneers, and also back in the day because of its nice straight stem. And mind you, these trees can get very large in girth, several feet, 4 to 5, 6 feet. You can go see these in Virginia. There's a few trees here that are pretty big too. At any rate, they would use them for ship masts because they were very straight trunks. It gets its name, its other name, tulip tree, which I prefer to call it, from its large flowers. The tree is actually in the magnolia family, not the poplar family. So these large greenish flowers with the orange center are high up in the canopy. You probably can't see them this time of year. They're so high up. They're insect pollinated and are visited by butterflies like the yellow swallowtail, tiger swallowtail, and others. The leaf is also very distinctive. In fact, I tell some school groups that the shape of the leaf will help you remember. It kind of does look like a tulip shape. So this tree is very common around Beaver Lake because of the seed cones. In the fall, after the flowers mature, and I don't have a seed cone here, the squirrels love them, especially red squirrels, and they take them and they chew off the seeds. And you'll often see piles of the eaten seeds at the base of a tulip tree where a red squirrel was using it as a vantage point while it ate to watch for predators. So this is a tulip tree, a very common tree here at Beaver Lake, and a very beautiful one at that. American chestnut. This tree at one time was considered the most important forest tree in much of North America. It sometimes consisted of 25 to 30% of the forest. The chestnuts, which if you look carefully you can see one inside of this, and this is the husk of another one that the chestnut has already fallen out. The chestnuts were considered the most delicious chestnuts in the world at its time until 1904. That's when, by accident, the chestnut blight, which is a fungus very similar to Dutch elm disease at any rate, was brought over from China on some Chinese chestnut wood material. And starting in about 1904, it spread throughout the population of chestnuts and decimated. Like I said, there were so many chestnuts, so they harvested the dead wood, and the only trees that survive to this day are trees like this. This is an arboretum, but it's resulting from root sprouts. So if you look at the base of the tree, there's several stems, trunks, coming from one trunk that had died. So it keeps putting up new sprouts. This one does produce the nuts, which is good. The leaves are very, very distinctive too. There's a few remnant populations. There's one in northern Michigan where they feel there's about 500 to 1,000 American chestnut trees because it occurred outside of its natural range and the blight hasn't affected them yet. They're working on strains that are crossed with the Chinese chestnut, which is resistant to the blight because it evolved with this fungus in China. So there's hope that someday, that if they get the right cross of the Chinese chestnut and the American chestnut, that they'll produce a tree that can withstand the ravages of chestnut blight. And someday, perhaps, the dream is to repopulate the forest with this beautiful icon, the American chestnut. American sycamore. Very, very distinct bark. You can see this tree from a distance and identify it. It likes to grow along waterways like creeks, streams, and rivers because of its, mottled bark. It almost, to me, looks like a camouflage. The reason its bark is like that is because it flakes off. The bark of this tree is actually very rigid. As trees grow, as you know, they grow in circumference. And in this case, the bark is so rigid, it cracks and breaks and falls off. A lot of trees compensate for that by having the bark create furrows. So young trees, you can see, are smoother, and as they get older, they get these little cracks and furrows. In this case, the bark is actually so rigid, it doesn't give until it sort of breaks and flakes off, creating a very beautiful pattern, sometimes a gray to white mottled bark with browns and darker greens. So it's a beautiful tree. In the spring, sometimes you might notice that the leaves don't come out. If you have one in your yard, or you have a relative growing called the London plane, which looks just like the American sycamore, the leaves will fall off. But don't fret, they'll grow back. It's a disease called anthracnose, and they often are affecting the trees, especially in moist springs, wet springs, but the trees always recover and they leaf out. These beautiful leaves that look a little reminiscent of a maple leaf shape. If you ever visited New York City, this is the emblem they use for the New York City Parks Department, the sycamore. Now this tree can get very tall. It can get to 150, 160 feet tall and huge in girth. There's records of George Washington took of a tree he measured at 44 feet in circumference. So there's tales of people hiding in the hollow trees of these giant sycamores, similar to what Robin Hood did with the Sherwood oak. So there's a lot of legends with this tree. The wood is very hard, and it's used for various things like furniture. But the main thing it's used for is as an ornamental. It's a beautiful tree by its beautiful bark, the American sycamore. Here we are. Sassafras. Sassafras trees grow here at Beaver Lake. Not very commonly. If you've ever been to Whiskey Hollow, they grow in that area. They're native to central New York and much of the Northeast. They're not a real big tree. They're kind of small, maybe only 80 feet tall. And here we have a whole sort of stand of them growing together in the Arboretum. Sassafras are known for very aromatic leaves and roots. The roots, in fact, were used initially for the flavor of traditional root beer. And they also make a tea from the very aromatic root. The leaves themselves are dried and ground up into a powder. If anyone's familiar with Creole cuisine and you've ever made gumbo, you use what's called filet powder, which is the dried, crushed leaves of the sassafras. It acts as a thickener, and it offers a nice flavor to the gumbo. I love making gumbo, and it's hard to find filet powder, but it's out there. Speaking of leaves, this is a fascinating tree because it has 3 different leaf forms. So if we take a look over here, on this one branch, we have the 3 types of leaves. We have a simple oval leaf. There are leaves that have 3 lobes. And my favorite is this one. Looks like Pac-Man a little bit, or Baby Shark. I won't start that song, but it looks like a mitten shape. So we've got the oval, sort of a trident, and the mitten shape. And again, these leaves are so fragrant. If you take a look at, and they're very soft. Of course, you can't see this on the film, but that's quite noticeable. So make your way to the Arboretum and feel free to take a leaf, crush it in your fingertips, and smell the beautiful smell of the sassafras.